Edmund Fitzgerald? Yeah, okay. How many of you know the song? All right, we got a few. The Edmund Fitzgerald was built in 1958 as hole number 301 at the Great Lakes Engineering Works at River Rouge, Michigan. More than 10,000 people watched as this vessel slid into the water on June 8, 1958. It had an overall length of 729 feet, and she and her sister ship, the Arthur B. Homer, became the largest carriers on the Great Lakes. But on November 10th, 1975, after 17 years of service on the lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald, having left Duluth, found itself in the worst storm to hit Lake Superior in over 30 years. Gale-force winds were being clocked at 80 miles per hour, and gusts were reaching an incredible 96 miles per hour on the lake that night. Waves were running 30 feet high. Men on the lake later recalled how the wind in the rigging sounded like dozens of air raid sirens all going at once. The waves pounding on the ships were, in their words, like 100 wrecking balls, all banging on the steel plates of the hulls. Mountainous waves crashed over the freighter, rolling 600 feet along the deck. And shortly after 7 o'clock, in the looming darkness, the Edmund Fitzgerald's long hull bent and then bent further and snapped like a broken bone. And her two great pieces foundered momentarily and began their tragic descent, approximately 500 feet, settling 170 feet apart from each other on the bottom of Lake Superior. Some people say that the breakup happened in a matter of seconds. One instant, she was plowing through the waves as high as a 3-story building, and the next, she was gone. And some of you may remember the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald from a song by Gordon Lightfoot, whose words said, "With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons or more, then the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. That good ship and true was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early." It is a fact of nature that inland waters, especially fresh waters, possess a unique treachery that is unknown to the open ocean. Fresh waters and inland waters don't have the even rhythms that we find with our oceans. Waves are often non-rhythmic and they're contradictory. Inland lakes are even more vulnerable because instead of surrounding land like oceans do, the water is surrounded by the land instead. Thus, those inland lakes are subject to quick temperature shifts and violent changes of weather. In addition, their smaller size instills a false sense of safety. Well, understand what the ship we see with in Lake Superior and what we deal with all of these lakes is true of what happens with the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is only 5 miles wide and 13 miles long. And it can be a very perilous sea because of its unique geography. Understand, when you look at the Sea of Galilee, the sea is unique among many other inland waters because it is over 600 feet below sea level. It's hard to imagine a lake being 600 feet below sea level, but that is the Sea of Galilee. In addition to that, the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by imposing mountains that are gouged with deep ravines. So picture this Sea of Galilee, 600 feet below sea level, and around it are the mountains with these gouges ripped down it. And these ravines. And these ravines that are cut in the side of the mountains tend to serve as gigantic funnels. And these funnels bring the cool mountaintop air down into the sea. Well, what do we have down at the sea? We have hot, warm air. And what happens is when those ravines bring the cold air from the mountains down and it meets the hot air below at sea level, it produces unpredictable, violent storms, such as was experienced on Lake Superior. That is the setting for the miracle that we are about to see tonight. As we pick back up with the miracles of Jesus, this is one of those miracles that is honestly one of the most well-known and quite possibly one of the most preached miracles. There are songs written about this miracle. Jesus had an important truth to reveal to the disciples in this miracle. And I don't think it's the truth that most of us think it is. God orchestrates an event in the lives of the apostles in order to increase their faith in the one they should already be trusting. Just think of all the miracles the disciples have seen up until this point. Every miracle we've looked at has taken place before this one. The most recent miracle the disciples have witnessed has been the raising of the dead when Jesus, as we talked about last week, raised the widow's son back to life. And while the truth that most of us hear when we think about this story, the truth of the matter that Jesus gets us through the storms of life, yes, that absolutely is a point we can learn from this miracle. But this miracle is not about that. This miracle is not about the fact that Jesus can come and calm our storm. This miracle is about the understanding who Jesus really is. That's what this miracle is about. He is the sovereign, all-powerful Lord. This miracle is about recognizing him for who he is, and when we recognize him for who he is, then fully trusting him. And so tonight in this miracle, I want us to consider 6 biblical truths that stand out for our edification as believers. Let me go ahead and dive right into it. The first truth is this: God is working in the circumstances of our lives. God is working in the circumstances of our lives. If you got your Bible, Mark chapter 4, let's look at verses 35 through 37. Mark 4, verse 35. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that it was already filling. All right, so Jesus, understand, as we talk about where Jesus is in this moment, Jesus has already had a very strenuous and physically exhausting day. Each and every one of us has experienced those kind of days. You ever get to about sunset or dinner time and you're like, man, I am just beat. So much so that you could care less if you eat dinner. You're just ready to go hit the sack and go to sleep. You know what I'm saying? You had those kind of days. This is Jesus' kind of day. Notice the first thing it says, on the same day. Well, this particular day had begun with the Pharisees confronting Jesus. And they had come at him by throwing blasphemous accusations at him that he was being controlled by Beelzebub, the devil. And so this is how Jesus' day began. The Pharisees coming at him declaring that he is working but for the devil. That's a wonderful way to start your day, isn't it? How would you like it if the first thing that happens when you go to work or go to the store in the morning is somebody says, hey, you look like you're working for Satan? That's a lovely thing. But that's what he's dealing with. And the confrontation that took place between Jesus and the Pharisees, it was a fierce one. But that didn't stop his day. More uncomfortable things took place because you see, after that, his mother and his half-brother show up. And so he's sitting there trying to teach some folks, and his mother and half-brothers show up, and they're demanding to see Jesus. We need Jesus. We want to see him right now. Take us to Jesus. And the reason they are wanting to see him is because they want to take him back to Nazareth, because people are beginning to think that Jesus has lost his mind. And we see that in the scripture as people are saying that Jesus is crazy. He's out of his mind. And Mary and his half-brothers are thinking, we got to do something about this situation. And so they go and try and confront Jesus about this. But Jesus, for his part, he rejects their pleas. And he then goes down to the sea where he begins teaching a great crowd of people parables. And the crowd was so vast that he finally got into a boat and he began teaching the rest of the day from this boat in the hot sun. So just picture, so that everybody can see him, he's standing in this boat with the sun beating down on him while he tries to teach them parables for the rest of the day. Now, this was an exhausting thing. Evening finally begins to arrive, and he and the disciples need to get some rest. And there's nothing unusual about this. So he tells them, notice what he says. He says, let us cross over to the other side. Now, understand a couple of things. First, they could have walked where they were wanting to go. The Sea of Galilee was not so huge that they couldn't walk where they wanted to go. But had they walked, guess who would have followed? That big, huge crowd. They needed rest. Jesus needed rest. And so that's part of why they didn't walk. We can see the evidence of the fact by when they shoved off from shore that a lot of these people, they would have followed him on foot, because some of these people, when Jesus struck off in the boat, what did they do? They got in their own little boats and said, let's follow him. Wherever he's going, we're going. We're not done hearing Jesus teach. We'll catch him on the other side. Let's go ahead and follow him in our little boats. And so they followed him across the sea. But once Jesus is on the boat and they set sail, Jesus immediately falls into a deep sleep. Suddenly, everything that can go wrong does go wrong. Mark, in his passage, tells us that a great windstorm arose. That phrase, great windstorm, it literally is speaking of hurricane-type winds. So just picture, they're on this boat, and they get out into the water, and suddenly hurricane-force winds are coming on. Not only were the winds hurricane-force, the ship is taking on water. Several of the men on this ship are seasoned sailors and fishermen, and they suddenly find themselves in a storm unlike anything they have ever experienced. Matthew's gospel uses the word seismos. What does that sound like? Seismos? Has to do with earthquakes, right? Exactly. He describes the storm as being like an earthquake. In other words, he's saying that it was like the sea was being shaken to its very core. The water rose and washed over the boat repeatedly. And at any moment, they feared they would be swamped to a watery grave. But there is one important detail I don't want you to miss when we talk about the fact that God is working in the circumstances. We've talked about all these circumstances. Jesus is exhausted. He's been confronted all day by people. He's been teaching in the hot sun all day. He's exhausted. He's now in the sea, in the boat, asleep, and here comes this massive hurricane-force storm. And don't miss this point, if we can get this to click. It was Jesus who led them into the storm. Jesus is the one who actually led them into the storm. None of this was an accident. Can we understand that this storm did not catch God Almighty off guard? This didn't catch him off guard. As I said, they could have walked where they needed to go. Jesus could have said, Jesus, I believe in the Father's wisdom, knew what was going to come on this sea that night. Jesus could have said, you know what, fellas? It looks like a pretty cold night up on that mountain. We got some hot air down here. It could be one of those nights where the weather gets pretty bad. Maybe we should just walk on around to where we need to get to. But he didn't do that. Instead, it was Jesus' suggestion that they take the journey by sea. It was at his direction and by following his instructions that they found themselves in this storm. What does that mean for us? It means we shouldn't be surprised when the unexpected takes place in our lives. In fact, sometimes it's when we follow Jesus' directions that Jesus leads us right into the storm. Have we ever thought about that? Jesus sometimes leads us right into the storm. Those moments when we experience these storms and these troubles in our lives, they are divinely ordained moments where God is working in the everyday circumstances of our lives. And He's doing it to reveal who He is, who we are, and who we need. Those trials and those tribulations, those difficult and desperate situations, those are often when God does His greatest work in our lives. How many times I've heard people question and wonder, why is this happening to me? I'm doing everything right. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to for God, so why is this happening? And sometimes those things happen because we're following God. Many times Jesus needs to bring us to the end of ourselves so that we are driven to Him and driven to Him alone as Savior and Rescuer. God was at work this whole time in every circumstance they faced, even in this storm. So, God is working in the circumstances of our lives. Secondly, Jesus is human without sin. He is human without sin. Notice the very first part of verse 38. It says, but He, Jesus, was where? In the stern, asleep on a pillow. I love this. Now, we've discussed this quite a bit in our look at the doctrines of the Bible and even in our 1 John series. However, the Bible is clear, and the true church has always believed that Jesus is both fully God and fully man. He has both a divine nature and a human nature that are united together in one person. 100% divine, 100% human, one person, the God-man. The only difference between His humanity and ours is that He was human without sin. He had no sin nature, and He never committed a single sin, not even one. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, for He made Him who knew no sin to be sin for us. Hebrews 4:15, we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. And that's one of the things we begin to see here in this miracle, is we begin to see the humanity of Jesus, and it is on full display. Well, where do we see His humanity? His humanity is seen as He sleeps. His humanity, God doesn't need to sleep, does He? But as a man, Jesus needed sleep. He fell asleep in the stern of the boat, and the Bible repeatedly teaches us about the Lord's full and true humanity. We see in Matthew 4:2 that He got hungry. We see in Mark 3 verse 5 that He got angry. In John 11:35 He cried. We know He died on the cross, and now we see He slept. He had an exhausting day, and He kept on sleeping right through the storm. In fact, this miracle is the only time in the Gospels that we ever read of Jesus actually sleeping. Isn't that interesting? The only time we read of Him sleeping is in the middle of a hurricane-force storm. Listen, some of you have been on a ship in rough weather, haven't you? Imagine being on a ship in hurricane-force winds with water pouring into the ship with each wave that beats against the ship. And Jesus isn't below deck as we sometimes picture. He's in the back of the ship. And he wasn't laying on a soft mattress. It says he had a pillow. Understand, it's not talking about the soft, cushy pillow that we go to sleep with at night. He was laying on hard boards, and the pillow is where the pilot would sit to steer the ship. There was nothing comfortable about where he was sleeping. Now listen, I'm going to say this. You have to be totally exhausted to find hard boards comfortable enough to fall asleep on. You ever tried to fall asleep on just a hard wooden board? Not easy. Fall asleep on something with no cushion, and yet he does it. That's how exhausted he is. Gets on this boat, lays down on these hard boards, and he is asleep. And yet he remained asleep even after the hurricane force wind started, even after the boat began to be tossed about and beaten by the waves, even as the water poured into the boat. And listen, if you've been in a storm out at sea, you understand when those waves are crashing, you've got water spray everywhere. Picture Jesus laying down on these boards, getting soaked and drenched with these waves and water spray coming in and these hurricane force winds, and he's still sleeping through it all. I don't know about you, I would wake up if I started getting soaked with water. I would have woken up as soon as the boat started doing this. But that's where Jesus is. He's asleep. That's how exhausted he was. But the question comes up, why was he able to sleep through the storm like that? Why was Jesus able to sleep through this storm? Let me give you this point. Because Jesus had complete trust in the Father's providential care. Jesus wasn't worried about a storm. He knew who was in control. The Father had it all. Yes, Jesus was human, but he had a complete and total trust that his Father was watching over him. These veteran sailors, they may be terrified, but the carpenter from Nazareth, he's sound asleep. Lottie Moon said this. She said, "I have a firm conviction that I am immortal until my work is done." Think about it. I have a firm conviction that I am immortal until my work is done. Do you understand that we are essentially immortal? We cannot die until God's work for us here on this earth is done. When God looks at us and says, "You've done everything I had assigned for you to do. Come on home." That's the moment. Jesus knew he had a work to complete on the cross. Jesus knew his end was not in this boat. He knew exactly where his end was. He knew what work had to be finished. And he was confident in his Father's promise to see him finish the work he had begun. So the storm didn't bother Jesus. That's why he could sleep right through the storm, because he trusted the Father. Now, let's look at the third major thing we see here. That is this: losing faith in the one we should trust results in panic. When we lose faith in that person we should be trusting, being God, the only result that comes from that is panic. Notice the last half of verse 38. Here's Jesus asleep. It says this, "And they awoke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?'" The apostles, listen, they are in full panic mode as the storm rages. Finally, in their panic, they go wake up Jesus, and immediately they begin criticizing him for sleeping through the storm. Notice Mark says they called him teacher. Matthew says they called him Lord. In Luke, they called him master. All three of these terms are terms of respect and honor. So they start off great. They wake him up. They begin with a term of respect and honor, but suddenly the direction changes. Because now, after getting him awake, they demand answers from Jesus. They demand answers. In Mark, they cry out, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" In Matthew, they cry out and say, "Save us, we are perishing." In Luke, they say, "We are perishing." Now, some might say that these three accounts give us contradictory messages. Which one is correct? What did they really say in this moment? I would venture to say that they're all correct. I don't think this was a case of one person going up and tapping on Jesus' shoulder and lightly saying, "Hey, Jesus, do you mind waking up? We got a little problem here." I don't think that's the case. There wasn't one person calmly speaking for the group. No, in their panic, they've all gone to Jesus, and they're all talking, I believe, at the same time, or talking one right after another. Peter probably pipes up and says one thing, and then here comes John putting his 2 cents in, and now Matthew says, you get the point. Listen, if you were there, that whole group is trying to get Jesus' attention and say, "What are you doing? Don't you see we're perishing?" You see, to them, it seemed that Jesus was indifferent to the situation they were in. They were in a desperate place with no help, no way of fixing it themselves, and Jesus was sleeping through it all. And so they lash out at Jesus in a rude outburst instead of exhibiting faith in the one who had clearly proven himself to be trustworthy already. Had Jesus not already proven who he was? Had he not already proven that he had power beyond anything else? But before we criticize the disciples too much for their reaction, don't we see ourselves in the disciples here as well? Think about it. Jesus has proven himself faithful to us over and over. And yet when something comes up and catches us by surprise, how often do we find ourselves feeling like we're being squeezed in a vice? And our reaction to that isn't faith. It's to get mad, to get upset. Why, Jesus? Don't you see what's happening here? Where are you, Jesus? Jesus, are you sleeping through my storm? How often do we react the exact same way the disciples did? Jesus, don't you care about what's happening to me right now? See, so many times instead of looking at him with doubt, we should look to him in faith. If Jesus can sleep through the storm, he must be confident in the outcome. Charles Spurgeon said this. He said, God is wise to err. Or he said, God is too wise to err, too good to be unkind. Leave off doubting him and begin to trust him, for in so doing, you will put a crown on his head. In other words, we put him in his rightful place when we trust him for who he really is. So, losing faith in the one we should trust, that results in panic. We see that with the disciples. We see it in our own lives. When we don't have our faith and trust in him like we should, we panic in our own trials and difficulties, don't we? That's what they did. Next, we see that Jesus has authority over nature because he is God. He has authority over nature because he's God. Look at verse 39. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Now listen, we've already seen the evidence of Jesus' humanity in this passage, but now we get the evidence of his deity. He was sleeping, but he's not sleeping anymore. Now he's doing what only God can do. God is the only one who is omniscient and knows all things. He is the only one who is omnipresent and exists everywhere at the same time. But God is also the only one who is omnipotent and has unlimited power. I think it's interesting that the first thing Jesus does isn't to chastise his disciples for their not-so-nice way of waking him up. Instead, after they woke him, the first thing he did was to issue a simple, and I love putting this word here, non-magical rebuke and command. There's no magic in what Jesus did. He didn't say hocus pocus or do some incantation. He simply issued a simple rebuke and command. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. That word rebuke primarily refers to the action of a corrective rebuke. When you hear the word rebuke, what do you think of someone doing? Someone trying to correct someone for doing something wrong, right? That's what we think of when we think of that word. It often means a censure. It's a way to correct something. And so the fact that Jesus rebukes it here, the fact that he rebukes the wind is very interesting. Why would Jesus rebuke the wind? Wind is inanimate, isn't it? It's not a living thing. Why would he rebuke it? How would you censure or correct the wind? Do you remember when we looked at the miracle of Jesus casting out the demon, the demon from the man in the synagogue? The exact same word was used in Mark 1:25 when Jesus rebuked the demons in the demon-possessed man. So let me ask you this. Is it possible that this storm had been demonically instigated and that God the Father had allowed it to happen to test the disciples? He rebuked it. Maybe that's what happened. But nevertheless, Jesus rebukes the hurricane force winds. Then he says, "Peace, be still." That word peace is the same Greek word that means to be silent. So Jesus gets up, rebukes the wind, and he tells the sea to be silent and be still. And in fact, that phrase, be still, carries the idea of a muzzle. So it's literally, he's saying, put a muzzle on it. In other words, Jesus is telling the sea to be still and to stay still. What an interesting thing. So Jesus issues this simple rebuke and command, and then we see that the response of the wind and the sea was immediate. As soon as Jesus spoke, the wind ceased and there was a great calm on the sea. Why? Why did they obey the moment Jesus spoke? Because the Master had spoken. That's why. Don't lose sight of the immediacy of the miracle. It's one thing to make the wind and the storm stop. It's a whole nother matter to make the sea immediately calm. Listen, recently we went on that cruise, and you all know that Sunday that we were gone, we had those storms that came through. Let me tell you, it made the seas rough. And you would think that once the storm passed, the seas would just calm down. No. For the next 2, 3, 4 days, I think the whole cruise, the waves just kept on beating that ship. And I'm like, oh no. Sunday, I spent the whole day in the cabin sick as a dog because the way the waves were moving that ship. And it wasn't even raining in that moment anymore. I was like, oh, this is killing me. Listen, just because the storm is gone doesn't mean the seas automatically calm down. You know that if you've ever been on the water. And yet in this case, we see Jesus' deity on full display. The hurricane force winds are stopped with a single rebuke. The waves are immediately calmed with 3 simple words from Jesus. Just imagine being on that boat and watching these waves come crashing into the ship, pouring water in. Jesus says 3 words, and suddenly the sea is perfectly calm. Only God could do such a thing. Jesus, therefore, must be God. And that is the direction that Jesus is trying to point the disciples here. Let me give you this next point. Trials and difficulties. I put happened on the screen. What did I put in your notes? Did I put happened? Yes, I have it right in your notes. Trials and difficulties happen for the benefit of our faith. Now that Jesus has addressed the storm, it's time to address his disciples. Notice verse 40. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" Just think of all the things the disciples have witnessed up until this point. As I said earlier, the last miracle they saw was Jesus literally raising someone from the dead. That's the last miracle they've watched him do. They've seen him heal lepers. They've seen him cast out demons. They've seen him turn water into wine. They've seen him heal the sick, those who were so sick that there was no hope left for them. By now, his disciples should have had a greater comprehension of who Jesus was, and they should have had a greater faith in him. This moment was a golden opportunity for them to learn from everything they had experienced up until this point. And yet they still came up short. Because instead of trusting him, they had accused him of forsaking them. Instead of trusting him, they had accused him of forsaking him. Unfortunately, this will not be the last time Jesus has to point out their lack of faith. They will continue to struggle with their faith until they finally see the resurrected Christ. Only then will they fully understand what he did for them on the cross. Yes, this trial was meant to help prove their faith, but they had failed to really learn the lessons of faith. In contrast to the disciples, though, listen, we have no excuse for a lack of faith. Let's be real. We have no excuse for a lack of faith. We know from the scriptures that Jesus is the all-powerful, all-knowing God, don't we? We know that he has taken care of all of our sin. We know that Jesus rose from the dead. We know that Jesus can be trusted no matter what comes our way. We know that trials and difficulties are divine appointments meant to strengthen our faith. And so if we know all of that to be true, why are we still afraid when the trials come? Do we, even today, with all the knowledge and evidence we have, can Jesus look at us and ask the same question? Why do you have no faith? Where is your faith? See, we have so much more knowledge than that his disciples had, and yet we still struggle with our faith. But let me share with you this last point. The most important issue is deciding who Jesus really is. The story ends with the disciples asking a question. It's a question that every one of us, every single person, must answer for themselves. Verse 41, and they feared exceedingly and said to one another, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? Tells us that they feared exceedingly. That means they were terrified. The fear they had after Jesus calmed the storm, this fear they have in this moment, it exceeded the fear they had over the storm itself. That's the idea being portrayed here. Their fear was even intensified from what they felt with the storm. Why? Because God's presence is more frightening than any force of nature. Put yourself in the presence of God, and you will find fear. See, these trials and tribulations, these forces of nature, all they can do is claim your life. But God has the power to claim your soul. Thus, the disciples see Jesus' exhibit as they see him exhibit this mastery over the wind and the sea, and they ask, who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him? Now, I will say this. Some people have said that this question shows that they are not sure whether Jesus is really God. That they're beginning to question and say, is this God? I don't believe that to be the case. In fact, I think this question is more in the rhetorical sense. Because these men, they knew the scriptures. And the scriptures were clear on exactly what Jesus just did. They were clear on what that meant. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey? If you got your Bible, I want you to turn with me to Psalm 107. Psalm 107. Who can this be that the wind and sea obey him? Psalm 107. And look with me beginning in verse 24. Psalm 107, verse 24. They see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he commands and raises what? The stormy wind, which lifts up the waves of the sea. They mount up to the heavens. They go down again to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. Then they cry out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that its waves are still. Then they are glad because they are quiet. So he guides them to their desired haven. Turn over a few Psalms. Psalm 65. Let's not take just one passage. Let's look at a second passage. Psalm 65, verse 7. Psalm 65, verse 7 says, You who still the noise of the seas, the noise of their waves, and the tumult of the peoples. Who calms the seas? Who stills and quiets the waves? It is God. Psalm 89, verse 9. Let's not be outdone. Let's not look at two. Let's look at a third. Psalm 89, verse 9. Says, You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Listen, the disciples knew exactly who had the power to still the wind and the waves. Only God. 3 times in the Psalms we see it made clear. They knew that Jehovah could still the seas by his word. Not to be outdone, I'll quickly read this one to you. Psalm 104 verse 7 says, But at your rebuke the waters fled. How about that? At your rebuke the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. Who has control of the wind and the sea? It's God. So when they ask this question, who can this be that stills the sea? It's a rhetorical question. There's only one answer. It's God. So, logic demands that Jesus must be the Creator God. The disciples' understanding of Christ in this moment suddenly shot right out of the universe. That was the purpose of this miracle. That's the lesson we take from this. It's not that God can calm the storm. We know God can calm the storm. I was listening to the radio to Pandora today. I have a Southern gospel station I listen to, and I was getting the handouts ready and the PowerPoint ready for tonight. And one of the first songs the first song that came on was a song that talked about this very miracle. And it said, sometimes he calms the storm and sometimes he calms his child. And we know that to be true, but that's not the point of this miracle. We know that God can calm the storm. We know that to be true. The point of it is that the God of the storm is there in the storm with us. Jesus was in the boat the whole time. God himself was there in the storm. Whether he calms the storm or not, he is in the boat with us. Therefore, we must trust him, knowing that he has got it all under control. He's there in the storm with us. Do you not care? Don't you care don't you see what I'm going through? And Jesus looks back and says, Of course I see it. I'm right here with you. I've got it. I've got it under control. We just need to trust him, knowing he's got it. Next week, some of you said you wanted to continue in the miracles for a little while, so we will do so for a few more weeks at least. Jesus heals the demoniacs in Gadara. That is the purpose, that's actually the destination that Jesus is going to as he goes on this trip across the sea. He is heading to Gadara, where he's going to now perform this next miracle. And so that's where we're heading. All right? Thank you for coming. God bless you.